Ah, the Cotton Bowl, one of the most famous stadiums in the country, the original home of the Dallas Cowboys, the famous New Year's Six bowl game with the same name, and an ungodly horde of crickets. Recently, investors announced a $140 million renovation into the historic stadium. According to Colby Farr of Community Impact, renovations on the Cotton Bowl Stadium will occur in 2 phases over the next 2 years. The project aims to enhance the visitor experience and modernize aspects of the stadium, including wider concourses, adding escalators, increasing hospitality areas and premium environments, and improving Wi-Fi also so that UT Woo girls can live stream their Red River experience sponsored by BetterHelp.
What do you want?
Well, I want a job that I can be proud of. And I want my parents to stop calling me for tech help. And I want to...
Nowadays, the stadium is commonly associated with the famous Oklahoma-Texas rivalry and the Texas State Fair. This rivalry is certainly one of the top in the sport, right up there next to the likes of Michigan, Ohio State, and Alabama-Auburn. But what if I told you that none of it, not the stadium, not the bowl game, would have existed without one of the oldest and slept-on rivalries in the sport? A rivalry between two of the closest major cities in the country, with nearly 150 years of bad blood between them. A rivalry between two tiny private schools who were dwarfed by the likes of Oklahoma in Texas today, but who brought national attention to Southern and Western football in the sport's early years. I am, of course, talking about the TCU-SMU rivalry, otherwise known as the Battle for the Iron Skillet, and this is how that rivalry started the Cotton Bowl. As crazy as it might be to think of today, football hasn't always been king. Even in red-blooded, gridiron states like Texas, football was once seen as a Yankee sport. And if you know anything about Texas and her southern cousins a century and a half ago, let's just say there are quite a few more things you would rather be called than a Yankee. However, this didn't stop people from taping up their ankles and heading out to their local wheat field for a round of concussions, fractured ribs, and the occasional death that ended in a 3-3 tie just before Sunday service.
It's about drive, it's about power. We stay hungry, we devour. Put in the work, put in the hours, and take what's ours.
From its northern and Ivy School origins, football began to trickle across the country. Still, the best teams and strongest fan bases stayed isolated east of the Mississippi. To promote the sport in new markets, exhibition games began to be played in the West and the South. Specifically, the end of the football season coincided with the harsh northern winter, which provided a great excuse to play games down south in Florida and Louisiana, or out west in the rising cities of California. On New Year's Day 1902, the city of Pasadena in California hosted the first ever bowl game to cap off a local parade which had started in 1890. The game showcased the best of the East against the best of the West, pitting the undefeated Michigan Wolverines against the 3-1-2 Stanford team. In a result that absolutely surprised no one, Michigan trounced Stanford 49-0. Despite the poor competition on the field, the Rose Bowl, as it would soon become known, would eventually become a smash hit and a staple of American culture. Back in the South and the Plains, teams yearned for such notoriety. Today, we think of brands like Oklahoma, Texas, and LSU as national powers, not to mention Nebraska before they abandoned all regionality. Go check out my older video right here if you want to learn more. But it hasn't always been this way. No matter how much modern revisionists try and convince you, these teams were not ordained by God from the inception of the sport. Yes, that means that there was a time that no one cared about the mighty Oklahoma Sooners or Texas Longhorns. God, what a world that would be. Now, this doesn't mean that they didn't have good teams or that they didn't win regional championships. Texas, for instance, fielded reputable teams and had a good amount of local support. But that's just it, local support. If you live in Austin in 1920, yeah, you might go to the games and cheer for your team, but no one in New York or Michigan or Ohio, the places where real football is played, would ever read about your teams in the paper. We have to remember, the South was poor. Even decades after the end of the Civil War, the region was still struggling to get back on its feet. We can make all the jokes about trailer parks in Mississippi or Alabama nowadays, but if you were to ask some poor sharecropper 100 years ago, they'd take that trailer in a heartbeat. We're talking about an area that's larger than the continent of Europe, where electricity wasn't just rare, it was almost unknown. That's how poor we're talking here. And football teams with their multiple positions, coaches, and equipment are expensive. Far more expensive than, say, a game where a bunch of guys line up in a diamond and hit a tiny ball with a stick. So it should be little to no surprise that in the South, the sport of the day was America's pastime, baseball, not football. That was until one Texas rivalry went mainstream. The TCU-SMU rivalry dates back to 1915, when the pair met up for the first time on the gridiron on TCU's new campus, only 5 years after they had moved back to Fort Worth from Waco following the great 1910 fire that burned down their old school, an incident that sparked a separate rivalry for a different video. This was only 4 years after SMU's founding, which always seems to surprise people whenever I remind them that SMU, with all their old money vibes, is actually younger than Texas State and UNT. Still, both schools were set up for success, as they were located in two rapidly growing cities, TCU in Fort Worth and SMU in Dallas. Well, actually Highland Park, but to make things easier, we'll give them Dallas. It was this geography that really sowed the seeds for the development of the rivalry, because it linked them to the deep-rooted animosity between the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth. I'll be going over that historic feud in my next video, but the important beats are that Fort Worth is not Dallas, and Dallas is not Fort Worth. The pair have been fighting each other since their inception, and I don't mean in a figurative sense. In the 1890s, the two professional baseball teams from the two cities, the Fort Worth Panthers and the Dallas Hams, played each other for the first time. Sounds fun, right? Just a friendly local match between a couple of upstart professional teams. Who won, you ask? Oh, we don't know, because the game was cut short after it erupted into a literal gunfight. So, enter little old TCU and SMU. The games alternated between TCU's campus in Fort Worth and Dallas's Fair Park, which was built as the city's second public park in 1886. The park's size led to it being used for large celebrations like political rallies, concerts, and of course, fairs. This was not the famous Texas State Fair that we think of today, as at the time, multiple cities would have their own state fair, meaning that they would all compete with each other for customers and clout. And what better way to advertise yourself than with live sports? Thus, the fairgrounds began to periodically host both Oklahoma and Texas in their rivalry game and the local TCU-SMU rivalry game. And I do mean the fairgrounds, as prior to any permanent stadium being built, folks would just crowd around a pitch of grass and watch guys go at it. As the decades rolled on, TCU and SMU began to separate themselves from the rest of their peers, regularly competing at the top of the pack in the infant Southwest Conference. So much so that they constructed new stadiums on their own campuses in the 1920s and shifted away from Fair Park altogether. SMU went undefeated in 1923 and won another 2 conference championships in 1926 and 31. TCU had similar success, winning conference titles in 1920 and then in 1929 and 32 under future legendary Ohio State Buckeye head coach Francis Smith. Even with all this success in the field, these two teams were still an afterthought in the college football world simply by virtue of being Texas teams. Because everyone knows Texans don't play real football. Without the cloud of being seen as one of the big boys, the postseason was non-existent for Texas teams. Ever wonder why the original tie-ins for the Rose Bowl were between the Big Ten and Pac-12? This is why. But this wouldn't stop these 10-gallon hat-wearing chads. After going undefeated in 1920, the TCU Horned Frogs gained an invite in their first ever bowl game, which just so happened to be located in, Fort Worth, Texas. The Fort Worth Classic, as it was called, wasn't just the first official bowl game in Texas, it wasn't just the first official bowl game in the South, it was the second official bowl game, ever. Let me repeat that. The only bowl game that was older than the Fort Worth Classic is the Rose Bowl itself. The only other one that comes close is the Bacardi Bowl, which was first played in 1907, but it was played in Havana, Cuba between an American team and a local Cuban sports club at the behest of the Cuban government, so nothing official. It was just the Rose Bowl and the Fort Worth Classic. That's it. This means that there's a timeline where the Fort Worth Classic becomes one of the country's oldest and most famous bowl games. Also, although the Rose Bowl was first played in 1902, the second game didn't come until 1916, only 5 years before the Fort Worth Classic, meaning that if the Fort Worth Classic would have stuck, the Rose Bowl would have only had it beat by 6 games. This also coincided with the 1920 West Texas oil boom and Fort Worth becoming the highest skyline west of the Mississippi and only being 60,000 people away from being the largest city in the state. God!
Oh, we were right there, man!
The game was a local hit, played in Fort Worth Panther Park in the current day LaGrave Field to a sellout crowd of 7,000. Which for comparison was about the same as the Rose Bowl's first game in 1902 and its second one in 1916. Trains to Fort Worth were sold out. It would be the event of a lifetime. A chance to show off Texan football on the highest stage. And the result? TCU got absolutely trounced, losing 63-7 to the Center Praying Colonels? Who the hell even is this? Out of Danville, Kentucky and currently D3? This is who obliterated TCU on the national stage? Why? Why, God? After extensive research, these dudes were incredible. National media called them America's Wonder Team. TCU went into the game as such heavy underdogs, most people didn't think they'd manage to score a point, and folks were pleasantly surprised when the Frogs got a touchdown. The season after winning the Fort Worth Classic, they upset the era's football powerhouse Harvard, who hadn't lost a game in 3 years. I mean, good God! From what I can tell, they were the driving force to what eventually became the SEC, as just about every historic SEC member was part of the same conference as them and left right after Center went on this tear. Somebody get Deluxe on this to make a What If Center State FBS video stat.
Now, let's get back to the show.
While the Fort Worth Classic was a regional success, it was expensive. Turns out bowl games have always been a money pit. So plans for a second showing were put on ice, or depending on who you ask, shifted out east where Dallas saw an opportunity, creating the Dixie Classic, Are You Getting a Recurring Theme Yet?, soon after. It took place in Fair Park's first stadium, simply known as Fair Park Stadium, with a capacity of 15,000. But that didn't stop them from cramming over 20,000 into the seats. The game was played on January 2nd, the day after the Rose Bowl, 1922, between the Southwest Conference champion Texas A&M Aggies and the, oh my god, the Center Praying Colonels again? And this is the game where the Aggies' 12th man story comes from? What were they feeding these boys in Danville? The Aggies won, but they literally had so many players injured by the Colonels that they had to ask for a student to suit up just in case they didn't have enough players to play the rest of the game.
Now I got the information that I need, and now I have to break your neck. It's just the way it is. I'm just a messenger.
Dallas's Dixie Classic had the same level of success as the Fort Worth Classic did before, but it still didn't catch on to be an annual event. It was played another 2 times in 1925 and 34. Clearly, local crowds were ready for a regular bowl game, but the region was still an afterthought in the football world. If they wanted to have their own Rose Bowl, they'd need the country to start taking Texan football seriously. Luckily, the TCU-SMU rivalry was hitting its peak at just the right time. In the 1935 season, TCU and SMU continued their dominance in the Southwest Conference. Thanks to the Fort Worth Classic and Dallas Dixie Classic, the schools were starting to get more national attention as the best teams of the region. This attention only increased as the season went on and both schools continued in their undefeated records. Every week, anticipation for the looming matchup between them at the end of the season grew until, on November 30th, the SMU Mustangs rolled into TCU's recently built Amon G. Carter Stadium. The battle was hailed the game of the century, and fans from across the country showed up in trains bound for Fort Worth to get a chance to see it. Both teams were highly ranked, and victory in the game not only guaranteed a conference championship, but also the greatest prize of them all, an invite to the granddaddy, the Rose Bowl itself. The 1935 season and game of the century are enough subject for their own video, so I'll be brief here. All you need to know is that this was a massive deal. Not just a cultural victory for Southern and Texan football, but for the sport in general, even being responsible for saving the dying NFL, who was struggling to compete with their college counterparts. But again, that's a story for another video. The biggie is that this game popularized a new concept of football, one where the quarterback stands in shotgun and attacks primarily by throwing the ball instead of running it, what we call the spread offense nowadays. This resulted in a thrilling back-and-forth game reliant on numerous passes instead of runs, far different than the gladiatorial slugfest found up north. Despite the recently built stadium only having a capacity of 25,000, as many as 45,000 crammed in to watch the fireworks, because what were the 30s without a blatant fire code violation? By the end of the game, SMU came out on top 20-14, after a Mustang defender batted down a ball thrown by future Washington Redskin legend Slingin' Sammy Baugh to prevent the Frogs from tying the game as time expired. Before the teams could even leave the field, the SMU band struck up playing California Here I Come, knowing the victory just secured them a spot in Pasadena. The game was a smash hit, putting Texan football on the map and catapulting TCU and SMU into the spotlight. Players from both schools became national celebrities, and local boosters used this publicity to advertise the developing hometowns. Despite the heartbreaking loss to their rivals, the Frogs wouldn't go into the postseason empty-handed, as TCU was invited to play in the second ever Sugar Bowl down in New Orleans, beating the LSU Tigers 3-2 in a monsoon so bad, players had to wade through knee-deep mud just to get a couple of yards. After emerging victorious, TCU ended the season ranked number 1, and was crowned the national champions by the Williamson ranking system. As expected, SMU received their invite to the Rose Bowl, and played Stanford on New Year's Day 1936. The Ponies went on to lose the game 7-0. However, due to there not being a standardized championship system, some systems crown their national champions prior to the bowl game being played, meaning that SMU, who ended their regular season undefeated, was crowned the 1935 national champions by the Dickinson system, despite them losing the Rose Bowl itself. Some sources claimed that TCU and SMU should just agree to be co-champions, sharing the crown. After all, the cities were so close, they must be fine with that, right?
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Fort Worth and Dallas backers hounded the football world to figure something out. The solution came in that next season, 1936, with the implementation of the AP system. Yes, that AP system. But the innovation didn't stop there, as wealthy Dallas booster J. Curtis Sanford was in attendance in the 1936 Rose Bowl. And while watching his Mustangs get absolutely nowhere against Stanford's defense, he looked around at the crowd of over 85,000 and wondered, why can't Dallas have a game like this? Returning home, Sanford worked with the team behind the Dallas Dixie Classic and formulated a plan to establish a regular bowl game in Texas. They realized that the biggest hurdle, the thing that killed off the Fort Worth and Dallas games previously, was that they were just flat out too expensive to put on every year. But unless you put it on every year, it wouldn't become established. By this point, both Miami and New Orleans had been running their games, the Orange and Sugar Bowls, for 2 years. Solving the money problem, Sanford committed to paying for the first 4 years of the new Dallas Bowl game directly out of his own pocket. The next step was finding somewhere to play the game. That choice was obvious, and they set their eyes on Fair Park Stadium. Now they just needed to find a way to make a grand entrance for the 1936 season. Luckily, 1936 was a special year in Texas, as it was the centennial, marking 100 years since the revolution and independence from Mexico. To celebrate, cities across the state submitted bids to be selected for the honor of hosting the World Fair-style Centennial Expo. At the time, all signs pointed to San Antonio as the winner, the home of the Alamo and the cultural heart of Texas, when, all of a sudden, in a highly controversial call, Dallas was announced as the host city. Cities across the state were outraged. In Fort Worth, legendary booster Amy G. Carter himself damned the decision and began his own project to stick it to Dallas, creating his own expo known as the Frontier Centennial. But again, that's a story for another video. To this day, it's still not known how or why Dallas was picked. Theories run from everything between bribes to logistical issues down south, but it's not hard to theorize state officials wanting to do everything they could to prop up the proposed Texas Bowl game. With the new contract, Dallas renovated Fair Park into much of what it is today, creating numerous exhibit halls, works of art, and event spaces. The Centennial was so successful that following the event, the official State Fair of Texas was created and has been held on the grounds annually since. But the crown jewel was the renovated Fair Park Stadium, now capable of seating over 45,000 spectators. Following the trending theme of taking names from prominent state exports like Florida's oranges and Louisiana's sugar, the stadium was officially named the Cotton Bowl. Unlike today's state fair, the Centennial ran year-round from 1936 to 1937, meaning the new stadium had quite the crowd in it for its first big showing, the rematch between nationally famous rivals TCU and SMU late that November. Hilariously, the game ended in a 0-0 tie as both teams failed to get anything going. But it still brought the desired attention back to North Texas, giving the country a glimpse into the new bowl, building anticipation for the postseason. By the end of that season, number 16 TCU earned an invite to the first ever true Cotton Bowl Classic, defeating number 20 Marquette. Of course, the game didn't make any money, but Sanford kept to his promise and paid for it out of his own pocket. The Dallas booster continued to lose money on the deal, but never wavered, determined to make the Texan Bowl game work. The coming years saw a steady increase in attendance, surviving the harsh years of World War II and emerging as one of the key destinations in college sports, eventually expanding the seating in 1948 and regularly averaging an attendance of over 75,000 by 1950. Oklahoma and Texas continued to play every season at the Cotton Bowl, becoming a staple of the yearly Texas State Fair. As for the TCU-SMU rivalry, which became known as the Battle for the Iron Skillet after a bet with an SMU fan frying frog legs in an iron skillet before a game, it slowly drifted into national obscurity. By this time, it was a new age in college sports. Small private schools, which once dominated the scene like TCU, SMU, Stanford, and the Ivies, were being replaced by massive public universities like Oklahoma, Alabama, and Ohio State. This led to the Cotton Bowl becoming more and more associated with the OU-UT rivalry rather than the one that started it, despite the fact that both games were played at the Cotton Bowl still. However, unlike with Red River, the Iron Skillet game was only played in Fair Park every other year. as the two schools alternated between playing in Fort Worth and Dallas. This continued all the way until 1998, when the pair played their last game in the stadium they inspired, with SMU winning 10-6. SMU would then move back to playing games in their home campus in the recently built Gerald J. Ford Stadium. Since then, TCU has dominated the series, going 19-4. Since the 90s, the Iron Skillet game has become an afterthought in college football, only gaining national attention whenever there's an upset or whenever someone is making a list of unique rivalry trophies. The teams continue to play each other annually, even after TCU's run of dominance starting in the early 2000s, and their subsequent moving up to a power conference with them joining the Big 12 in 2012, only 2 years after winning their own Rose Bowl and avenging their loss in the game of the century by beating Big 10 champion Wisconsin to cap off an undefeated 2010 season. The new dynamic between TCU and SMU has been awkward to say the least. A power team in a regularly alternating schedule with a non-power rival? From TCU's perspective, it was a lose-lose agreement, because if they beat SMU, as regularly happened, then it didn't help their resume as they'd only beaten a non-power opponent. But if they lost to SMU, as happened in 2019 and 2021, then a power team just lost to a non-power opponent. Even still, the greatest issue was the lack of energy behind the game. By this point, TCU had dominated the series for over 2 decades, so fewer and fewer TCU fans saw SMU as a real rival, especially when compared to conference opponents like Baylor and Texas. Sadly, this led to TCU announcing an indefinite suspension of the rivalry game after the 2025 season. As for my opinion, I'm optimistic that the game will return, and ironically, I think that this suspension will help reinvigorate the rivalry, which has gone stale. Just look at SMU's response immediately after TCU made the announcement. They rallied their boosters together and pushed their way into the ACC, determined not to be left behind. Then, almost overnight, they raised tens of millions of dollars for renovations to their stadium and facilities, and a commitment to become a football school again. Now, of course, one might say if they had done this 20 years ago, as TCU had, we wouldn't be in this situation, but I digress. I'm just happy to see them pushing themselves to get to that point, because the battle for the Iron Skillet has the potential to return to national fame. As for the Cotton Bowl itself, the bowl game moved out west to Arlington, along with the somehow still named Dallas Cowboys following the construction of AT&T Stadium in 2009, much to the chagrin of the city of Dallas. As a Fort Worther, I just love the irony of it. A bowl game which can be traced back to Fort Worth, finally coming back west. Even if it's not in Fort Worth proper, Arlington is close enough. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the original Cotton Bowl Stadium is undergoing renovations, but only sees limited use, primarily for the single game between Oklahoma and Texas. Nowhere near the levels of its heyday when it was hosting SMU home games, the Iron Skillet game, the Dallas Cowboys, the Red River Shootout, and the bowl game. So, Fort Worth came out on top. But what do you think? How much of the story did you already know? Do you like the Cotton Bowl better in Dallas or over at AT&T? Whatever you think, comment below, and as always, I will catch you on the next one.